Everyone talks about leadership principles from business schools and management gurus, but what if the most powerful transformation story comes from a world of swords, honor, and impossible choices? What if a single framework could take someone from absolute nothing to legendary status, not through luck or privilege, but through 7 principles that still work today? The story you're about to hear happened over 400 years ago in feudal Japan, and it reveals exactly how someone with no advantages, no connections, and no reason to succeed became one of the most respected leaders of his era by following the Bushido code. The man's name was Tagawa, and when his journey began, he was nobody. Spring of 1575 brought rain to the rice fields outside Kyoto, and Tagawa worked those fields with his father and 2 younger brothers, planting seedlings in mud that came up to his knees. He was 17 years old, and his entire world consisted of 3 things: rice, taxes, and survival. The samurai who collected taxes from his village rode horses and wore 2 swords, and they treated peasants like Tagawa the way you'd treat furniture, useful when needed, but not worth noticing otherwise. One of those samurai had the legal right called Kirisute Gomen, which meant he could cut down any peasant who disrespected him, and Tagawa had watched it happen when he was 12. A farmer named Jiro had looked a samurai in the eye for too long, and the samurai drew his katana and killed Jiro in the middle of the village square, while everyone watched and did nothing, because doing something meant dying next. That memory lived in Tagawa every single day, not because it made him hate samurai, but because it showed him exactly how the world worked when you had no power. His father told him that peasants were born to serve and die in the same fields where they were born, that trying to rise above your station was not just impossible, but offensive to the natural order. Tagawa believed him for 17 years, right up until the day Lord Imagawa's army came through their village recruiting peasant soldiers for the war against Oda Nobunaga. The samurai officer who addressed the village made it clear that volunteering meant a 1 in 3 chance of dying in battle, but it also meant regular food, basic training, and if you survived, the possibility of becoming a shigaru, a foot soldier with status just above peasant. Tagawa's father forbade him from volunteering because losing a son meant losing labor in the fields, but that night, Tagawa made a choice that would define everything that followed. He looked at his sleeping brothers and his exhausted father, and he understood that staying meant becoming exactly what his father was, a man whose entire life would be erased the moment he stopped being useful in someone else's rice field. Before dawn, he walked to the recruitment point and joined Lord Imagawa's army. The training camp was a nightmare of discipline, brutality, and men who'd been soldiers their entire lives, treating new recruits like they were less than human. Tagawa learned to march, to hold a yari spear without dropping it, and to follow orders instantly because hesitation got you beaten by the training master. 3 months in, he'd watched 12 recruits quit and go back to their villages, and he understood why. Because everything about military life was designed to break you until obedience became instinct. The first real test came during night watch, when Tagawa and another recruit named Kenji were guarding the supply tent. Kenji had been stealing rice rations and selling them to local merchants, and he approached Tagawa with an offer to split the profits, because the officers never checked inventory carefully. The smart move was saying yes because everyone stole something, and extra money meant you could buy better sandals, warmer clothes, things that kept you alive when winter came. Tagawa thought about it for exactly 1 night, and then he remembered watching Jiro die because a samurai could do whatever he wanted without consequences. The difference between a samurai with honor and a samurai who was just a killer with a sword was that one of them followed principles even when breaking them was easier and safer. He told Kenji, no, and when Kenji kept stealing, Tagawa reported him to their commanding officer, even though it meant every other recruit would hate him for being a snitch who got one of their own punished. The officer called Tagawa in privately and asked why he'd reported something that didn't affect him personally, and Tagawa said that if they couldn't trust each other with rice, how could they trust each other in battle when someone's life depended on your integrity? The officer stared at him for a long time, and then he said one word that changed Tagawa's trajectory. Rectitude meant doing what was right even when it cost you personally, and peasants who understood that concept were rare enough to be worth watching. 6 months later, Tagawa's unit marched to their first battle at a place called Nagashino, and nothing in training prepared him for what happened when two armies actually tried to kill each other. Lord Imagawa's forces were facing Oda Nobunaga's troops, and Nobunaga had something new that would change Japanese warfare forever: arquebuses, matchlock firearms that could punch through armor from 100 yards away. The battle started at dawn, and Tagawa's unit was in the third wave of infantry advancing toward Nobunaga's position. The sound of gunfire was so loud it felt like someone hitting you in the chest with every shot, and men around him started dropping before they even saw the enemy. His commanding officer took a musket ball to the throat and went down, which meant their unit had no leadership, and everyone started breaking formation, because staying in line meant standing still while people shot at you. Tagawa watched the unit dissolving into panic, and he had a choice that defined the second virtue. Running meant survival, staying meant probable death, but a unit without leadership was just a group of individuals who would all die separately, instead of having a chance together. He planted his spear in the ground and started yelling for everyone to form up on his position, to get behind cover and maintain formation like they'd trained. Nobody knew who he was or why they should listen to a peasant recruit, but his voice was the only clear sound in the chaos, and desperate men will follow anyone who sounds certain even if they're making it up. 20 men formed a defensive position behind a small ridge, and Tagawa organized them into rotating ranks that could present spears toward any cavalry charge while staying low enough to avoid the worst of the gunfire. They held that position for 3 hours while Lord Imagawa's army collapsed around them, and when reinforcements finally came, Tagawa's group was one of the few units still intact. The reinforcement commander asked who was in charge, and 20 men pointed at Tagawa. After Nagashino, Tagawa wasn't a peasant recruit anymore. He was an ashigaru with his own squad of 10 men, and the promotion meant he had power over others for the first time in his life. The easy path was treating his squad the way training masters had treated him, with brutality and contempt, because that's how you maintain discipline in an army. 2 of his squad members were former farmers like him, but 3 were from merchant families. 2 were former bandits who'd been given the choice between execution and military service, and 1 was a burakuman, a member of the outcast class that handled dead bodies and leather work. Traditional military hierarchy said you could beat subordinates who disobeyed, and everyone expected Tagawa to establish dominance through fear, because that's what worked. He tried it for exactly 1 week, and then he realized that fear made men follow orders, but it didn't make them trust you when things went wrong. Compassion, meant understanding that strength existed to protect people, not exploit them. Tagawa started running his squad differently by learning each man's background, their skills, what they were good at, and what terrified them. The former bandit named Ryota was brilliant at scouting, but panicked in close combat, so Tagawa put him on reconnaissance where his skills mattered. The burakuman named Saburo was treated like contamination by other squads, but Tagawa made him second in command, because Saburo understood tactics better than anyone else, and being an outcast meant he paid attention to details that others missed. When one of the merchant's sons froze during a skirmish and nearly got killed, other squad leaders would have beaten him and called him a coward, but Tagawa spent an entire night talking him through the fear and explaining that everyone was terrified. The difference was learning to act despite terror rather than pretending it didn't exist. Respect, meant treating everyone with dignity regardless of their background, because how you behaved when you had power revealed who you actually were. Other ashigaru mocked Tagawa for being soft, for treating his squad like they mattered, but when their unit faced a night raid by enemy scouts, Tagawa's squad responded faster and fought harder than any other group, because they trusted their leader and each other. Saburo came up with a defensive formation that saved their position, and afterward, Tagawa made sure everyone knew it was Saburo's strategy, giving him credit publicly, even though an outcast getting recognition made some officers uncomfortable. That single act of respect meant Saburo would have died for Tagawa, and the rest of the squad saw that their leader valued competence and loyalty over social status. 2 years into his service, Tagawa's reputation had grown enough that a samurai officer named Captain Honda recruited him as a personal adjutant, which meant Tagawa was now advising actual samurai on tactics and strategy. Honda was a tactical genius, but he had a gambling problem that he hid from Lord Imagawa, and he'd been taking funds from the military budget to cover his debts. Tagawa discovered this by accident when he was reviewing supply requisitions and noticed discrepancies that didn't make sense. The smart political move was pretending he hadn't seen anything, because Honda was his patron, the man who'd elevated him from Ashigaru to a position of real influence, and exposing him meant destroying his own career, because nobody would trust someone who betrayed their direct superior. Tagawa spent 3 days considering his options, and then he remembered that Makoto, honesty and sincerity, meant your words and actions had to align, or you had no honor at all. He went to Honda privately and laid out exactly what he'd found, and he gave Honda 2 choices: either confess to Lord Imagawa and take responsibility, or Tagawa would report it himself because he couldn't be part of a deception that harmed their entire unit. Honda was furious and threatened to have Tagawa executed for insubordination, but Tagawa stood his ground and said that if Honda killed him for telling the truth, then Honda had already lost his honor anyway, and Tagawa would rather die than serve a dishonorable man. That statement cut through Honda's anger, because it was exactly what a samurai was supposed to believe about honor, and hearing it from a peasant who'd become an adjutant made Honda realize how far he'd fallen. Honda confessed to Lord Imagawa the next day and accepted full responsibility, which should have ended with his execution or forced seppuku. Instead, Lord Imagawa demoted him but allowed him to serve as a regular samurai because Honda's honesty in confessing impressed him more than the crime itself, and Imagawa specifically asked who had discovered the theft. When he learned it was Tagawa, and that Tagawa had given Honda the chance to confess first, Imagawa summoned him privately and offered him something impossible: the opportunity to become a samurai. Peasants didn't become samurai, it violated every social rule of feudal Japan, but Imagawa said that anyone who understood honor and integrity better than most samurai deserved the position regardless of birth. Tagawa became a samurai at 23 years old, which made him one of the youngest and certainly the only former peasant in Lord Imagawa's inner circle. The other samurai hated him because his existence was an insult to their birthright, and they tested him constantly to find weakness that would justify removing him. The worst challenge came during a diplomatic mission to negotiate with a neighboring lord named Takeda, where Tagawa was part of the delegation representing Imagawa's interests. The negotiation was about military alliance against Oda Nobunaga, but during a private dinner, Lord Takeda offered Tagawa a secret deal: switch sides and bring intelligence about Imagawa's defenses, and Takeda would make him a captain with land, wealth, and status that would take decades to achieve under Imagawa. The offer was everything Tagawa could have wanted: the security and respect that seemed impossible for someone born in a rice field. And Takeda made it clear that Imagawa would never know, because Tagawa could simply claim the negotiations had failed. Nobody would blame him for taking the deal, especially since other samurai in Imagawa's service treated him like an outsider anyway. But Meiyo honor meant that personal reputation and moral integrity were more valuable than any material gain. And Chugi, loyalty, meant commitment to the person who'd given him a chance when everyone else said peasants couldn't rise. Tagawa refused Takeda's offer immediately and reported the attempted bribery to Imagawa the moment they returned, even though it meant making a powerful enemy and possibly starting a conflict. Lord Imagawa assembled his war council after hearing Tagawa's report, and several advisors argued that they should accept Takeda's alliance offer anyway, because they needed military support against Nobunaga. Tagawa spoke against it and explained that any lord who would try to bribe another lord's samurai couldn't be trusted as an ally, and forming an alliance with Takeda would mean constantly watching for betrayal instead of focusing on the real enemy. His reasoning was sound, but what impressed Imagawa most was that Tagawa had rejected wealth and status to maintain his honor, which was exactly what the Bushido code demanded, and what most actual samurai failed to do when tested. Imagawa rejected the alliance, and 6 months later, Takeda proved Tagawa right by attempting to invade Imagawa's northern border while they were engaged with Nobunaga's forces. By the time Tagawa turned 30, he commanded his own unit of 200 men, and his reputation had spread beyond Lord Imagawa's territory. Other lords tried to recruit him, offering positions and wealth, but he stayed loyal to Imagawa because loyalty wasn't about who offered the most money. It was about honoring the commitment that had defined his entire transformation. His unit was known for 3 things: tactical excellence, zero tolerance for corruption, and a culture where merit mattered more than birth. Former peasants, merchants, and outcasts could rise in Tagawa's unit if they demonstrated the 7 virtues, and the result was a group that fought harder and stayed more cohesive than units led by traditional samurai who relied on fear and hierarchy. The final proof of Tagawa's leadership came during the siege of a castle held by one of Nobunaga's generals, where Imagawa's forces had been stalemated for 3 months. Traditional tactics weren't working, and casualties were mounting without progress. Tagawa proposed a strategy that combined misdirection, night raids, and psychological warfare that would minimize their losses while forcing the enemy to abandon the castle, but it required perfect coordination and trust between units. Several senior commanders opposed the plan because it was unconventional and put Tagawa in overall tactical command, which offended their sense of hierarchy. Lord Imagawa approved it anyway, because everything Tagawa had done for 15 years had proven that his judgment was sound and his priorities were right. The operation worked exactly as planned. The castle fell with minimal casualties, and Lord Imagawa gave Tagawa land and the title that made him a landed samurai with his own estate. The peasant who'd left his father's rice field at 17 had become a lord himself, not through luck or privilege, but by embodying 7 principles that guided every decision he made. G meant he chose integrity over convenience. U meant he acted with courage when others hesitated. Jin and Rei meant he served and respected his people rather than exploiting them. Makoto meant his word was absolute. Meiyo meant he protected his honor above all material gains, and Chugi meant his loyalty was unshakable. Those principles transformed him from nothing into someone whose name would be remembered centuries after his death. Tagawa's story happened over 400 years ago in a culture that no longer exists, but the principles that guided his transformation are exactly what modern leaders need today. Because human nature hasn't changed. You don't need to be a warrior or live in feudal Japan to apply the Bushido code. You just need to understand that leadership without principles leads to exactly the kind of failures we've seen in companies like Theranos, Uber, and WeWork, where leaders chased growth without integrity and destroyed everything they built. The 7 virtues work because they create a framework for operating when you have power over others, when your decisions affect people's lives, and when doing the right thing costs you something real. Start with rectitude, and make one decision this week based on what's right rather than what's convenient or profitable. You know there's a conversation you should have with a team member about their performance, and you've been avoiding it because it's uncomfortable, but having that conversation honestly and directly serves them better than letting problems continue. You see your company cutting corners on quality to meet a deadline, and speaking up might make you unpopular, but staying silent when you see something wrong means you've already compromised your integrity. Rectitude means accepting the personal cost of doing what's right, because your character is defined by the choices you make when nobody's forcing you to be ethical. Apply courage by making decisions with incomplete information and committing to them fully. Your industry is changing, and you need to make strategic calls about new technology, remote work policies, or business model shifts, and waiting for perfect information means you'll never act. Courage isn't recklessness, it's the ability to make the best decision you can with what you know and then adjust as new information comes in, which is exactly what every leader faces when navigating uncertainty. During crises, courage means being the voice of clarity when everyone else is panicking, giving your team direction even when you're not certain, because leadership requires acting despite fear. Practice Jin and Rei, compassion and respect, by serving your team first and treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their position. When someone on your team is struggling, your first question should be how you can support them rather than why they're not performing, because people grow faster in environments where leaders care about their well-being and development. Respect means creating space where every voice matters, where junior team members feel safe challenging senior leaders, where diverse perspectives are valued rather than just tolerated. Google's research proved that psychological safety is the biggest factor in team performance, and that safety comes from leaders who practice compassion and respect consistently. Demonstrate Makoto, honesty, by admitting when you don't know something or when you've made a mistake. Teams lose faith in leaders who fake expertise or make excuses, but they'll follow someone who admits error and takes responsibility, because honesty builds trust faster than perfection. When you present to leadership and they ask a question you can't answer, saying you don't know but you'll find out is stronger than pretending to have answers you don't have. When your strategy doesn't work out, acknowledging it directly and explaining what you learned is how you maintain credibility, rather than trying to spin failure as success. Embody Meiyo, honor, by taking full accountability for what happens on your watch. Your team misses a deadline that affects other departments, and you could list all the legitimate reasons why it happened, but honor means owning the failure to leadership first and then working with your team privately to address it. Protecting your reputation and your organization's reputation requires holding yourself to standards higher than what anyone else demands, which means you don't blame circumstances or subordinates when things go wrong. After the Volkswagen emissions scandal, the CEO resigned within days because he understood that the company's dishonor was his dishonor, and that's the essence of Meiyo in modern leadership. Practice Chugi, loyalty, as a reciprocal commitment to your team's success and the shared mission you're pursuing together. Loyalty today isn't blind obedience to authority, it's a mutual dedication where you're committed to your team's growth and well-being, and they're committed to the vision because they believe in it. When Howard Schultz led Starbucks through the 2008 financial crisis, he refused to cut health benefits for employees, even though it would have saved money, because he believed loyalty to his people was non-negotiable during hard times. That commitment meant employees stayed loyal to Starbucks through the crisis, and the company recovered faster than competitors who'd destroyed trust by abandoning their teams. The transformation that happened to Tagawa over 15 years didn't come from talent or luck. It came from choosing principles and following them consistently, even when they cost him opportunities, relationships, or safety. Every major decision he made was guided by asking which virtue applied to the situation and what that virtue demanded, and over time those choices compounded into a reputation for integrity that made people want to follow him. Modern leadership works exactly the same way because trust, character, and respect compound over time when you make decisions based on principles rather than convenience. You don't need to be perfect, and you won't follow the code flawlessly, but having a framework means you know when you've compromised and you can correct course instead of drifting into patterns that destroy your credibility. What code are you following right now in your leadership, even if you've never named it or written it down? Your principles reveal themselves in how you treat people when nobody's watching, in the decisions you make when choosing the easy path wouldn't have consequences, in whether your team trusts you when things get difficult. The Bushido code works not because samurai were perfect, but because the principles themselves are designed for imperfect people who need a compass when the right path isn't obvious and the pressure to compromise is overwhelming. Tagawa rose from a rice field to become a legend by embodying 7 virtues that guided him through impossible choices, and those same virtues will guide you if you choose to follow them, not by wielding a sword but by serving with strength of character, honor, and purpose.